Gods in anime universes, they take all different kinds of forms. Some fall into the Judeo-Christian ideologies of what a god would look like, a big man with a white scruffy beard, while others take a more abstract approach at what a god would look like the anti-spiral or truth from Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, while other manga like Boruto introduce God through the medium of aliens that have ascended to a level of godhood. There's truly no one way to depict gods in anime and manga, almost like they're all made up to begin with, and therefore any depiction of a god in an anime or a manga is gonna play by the rules of said anime and manga. But one thing that you pretty rarely see in anime and manga is the presence of more than one godly-like being. See, while there's obviously shows like Record of Ragnarok, which revolve around the fact that there's hundreds of different gods, by and large, if an anime or a manga introduced a god, that's the only god, which is interesting because pretty much every single religion in Japan is polytheistic, whether that be Shinto, Hindu, or Buddhism. But there is one very popular anime and manga that abandons the monotheistic style, and that anime manga is Seven Deadly Sins. See, Seven Deadly Sins has way more than just one god. In fact, Seven Deadly Sins kind of has four. Now, the reason that I say kind of has four is because Seven Deadly Sins does technically have one god. However, that god decided to make other gods, and then those gods teamed up together to seal away the one true god, but then at the end of the story, the one true god is revealed. And now, in the Four Knights of the Apocalypse, that one true god is the bad guy. By the way, Four Knights of the Apocalypse, very much coming out in Japan, just for some reason not hitting America. But today, I want to talk about these four gods and where their differences lay, and their histories and their abilities, and maybe more importantly than anything, how hard they punchy, at least in comparison to each other, because when you're talking about gods, we're talking about impossible level feats and multiversal blah 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 blah. It's boring, it's overdone. But at the same time, there's enough information about most of the gods in the Seven Deadly Sins universe that I could do an individual deep dive on every single one of them. So today is going to be kind of a cursory toe dip in the water that is the gods of the Seven Deadly Sins universe, because the Supreme Deity, the Demon King, and Chaos could all get their own videos. So more than anything, this video will be focused on how hard they punchy, which is why today we're talking the gods of the Seven Deadly Sins universe, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys ever want to truly rank and explain all of the content that I put out, then you're gonna have to follow my anime podcast, Who Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to look like somebody who ranks and explains anime, go ahead and wander into my anime merch store, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime sweatshirts, t-shirts, and sticker packs on demand. So gods, how do you rank them? Aren't they all these infinitely powerful beings? And if they all technically have infinite power, shouldn't they all exist in the same catch-all of one above all? Well, I guess kind of, because genuinely, who are we to say that the anti-spiral would be able to be truth in a fight? I mean, they're both conceptual beings. And genuinely start talking about the fact that, oh, the anti-spiral is everything, and it's multiple universes tall, and it has gravity manipulation and time manipulation, but truth is everything, so truth will win it about. It's silly. I get talking about versus battles between people that aren't conceptual beings and have physical and recordable feats. But once we get up to the god level and we start talking about things that are just quite literally entire universes smashing into each other, conversation gets a bit diluted in my mind. However, in the Seven Deadly Sins universe, fortunately, amongst the four gods that we know of, there's a definitive pecking order. Now, this is because in the Seven Deadly Sins universe, there is one god that existed before everything else. And then that god made three other gods. Now, as to which of these three gods is the strongest out of the three gods that were created by the one god above everything else, that's kind of where the conversation gets a bit more difficult. But fortunately, even amongst those three gods, there is a pretty definitive pecking order. And unfortunately, at the bottom of that pecking order is the sacred tree. I mean, come on. It's a tree. Is it a very powerful tree that has a bunch of cool abilities and is the backbone of the fairy clan? One of the strongest clans in the entirety of the Seven Deadly Sins universe? Absolutely. Can it walk? No. So what is the sacred tree, and what abilities does it have, and why is it on the bottom of this pecking list? And no, the answer is not no legs. See, the sacred tree is a tree located in the center of the Fairy King's forest. And the reason that the sacred tree exists in the center of the Fairy King's forest is because the sacred tree is the reason that Fairy King's forest exists in the first place. And therefore, all of the power of the sacred tree emanates out in a circle, thus making it dead center. Now, outside of making sure that the Fairy King forest continues to exist, the Sacred Tree also gives all life to the Fairy Clan, and it is also the entity that gives all power to the Fairy King. And the Fairy King must use that power granted to it through the Sacred Tree in order to defend Fairy King's forest. But the Sacred Tree isn't necessarily sentient. See, the Sacred Tree exists to protect the fairies. However, King informed us that the Sacred Tree has no feelings of evil. All fairies and their abilities are linked to the Sacred Tree, but only a few fairies are born from the Sacred Tree. And the fairies that are born from the Sacred Tree eventually become the Fairy King. See, because the Sacred Tree decides who becomes the next Fairy King. And when the Sacred Tree decides that a new Fairy King needs to sit on the throne, it will give birth to a new fairy. And the Sacred Tree has had to do this twice. See, after the creation of the Fairy Realm and the Fairy Folk, the Sacred Tree gave birth to Gloxina, who would later become the first Fairy King. However, after Gloxina decided to defect to the Demon Realm and then got sealed away in the Eternal Coffin, the Sacred Tree had to once again give birth to a new Fairy King, and this new Fairy King was Dahlia. However, Dahlia unfortunately disappears, and therefore the Sacred Tree once again has to give birth to a new fairy, and that was Harlequin, also known as King. Now, the reason that the Sacred Tree sits on the bottom of the totem pole in power when it comes to gods in the Seven Deadly Sins universe is that the Sacred Tree was the last offspring of Chaos, thus making the Sacred Tree the little sibling to both the Demon King and the Supreme Deity. And also, it doesn't have legs. However, just because the Sacred Tree exists in fourth place does not mean it's not incredibly powerful. Sacred Tree has an enormous amount of magical power. Not to mention, it's also incredibly resilient, as all sacred spears are made from the Sacred Tree, like Basquias and Chastafel, while also having the ability to passively make the Fountain of Youth, effectively granting whoever consumes it access to immortality. But the Sacred Tree also does have a myriad of other, more powerful techniques. Techniques that Sacred Spears are able to tap into by the usage of their ability, Disaster. The first ability that the Sacred Tree has is Pollen Guard. This allows the Sacred Tree to release healing pollen whenever it's injured that heals any and all wounds, something that King Chastafel is eventually able to use. And since we're talking about Chastafel, the Sacred Tree also has the ability Guardian, which allows the moss on the Sacred Tree to grow into the shape of a sentient guardian that's able to fight people that are attacking the Sacred Tree away, much in the same way that Chastafel's pillow shape is able to turn into a big bear. On top of this, the Spirit Tree also has an ability known as Sunflower, which allow the highest branches of the Sacred Tree to grow a sunflower capable of gathering and shooting off concentrated rays of solar energy. But this isn't even necessarily the strongest application of Sunflower, because if you take an ivy from Sunflower, you can get something known as the Death Thorn. And if you or anybody you slash with the Death Thorn receives even the slightest of a cut from this Death Thorn, they die, meaning that the Death Thorn is basically a one-hit KO. However, knowing all of this and the fact that the Sacred Tree was made alongside the Supreme Deity and the Demon King, I can't sit here and say just because they were all made by the same entity Chaos that the Sacred Tree is on the same level as the Demon King or the Supreme Deity. And therefore, the Sacred Tree exists in our 4 spot. And that'll make a lot more sense as we get more into the abilities of both the Demon King and the Supreme Deity. Because at least from what we've seen, the Supreme Deity and the Demon King have a lot more in the way of abilities. But the real question is, who's coming in at number 3? And unfortunately, there's literally no right answer here. The idea behind the Supreme Deity and the Demon King is that for thousands of years, they were locked in battle against each other, and they realized they were so evenly matched that they just decided to make a truce. And yeah, that truce gets broken a couple of times, and war breaks out between the angels and the demons. And sure, the Supreme Deity and the angels partner up with a couple of different clans and eventually garner enough power to be able to defeat the Demon Clan and the Demon King, pointing at any of these feats and saying concretely the Demon King is stronger or the Supreme Deity is stronger is just impossible. So I'm gonna go on vibes. Since the Demon King and the Supreme Deity are very clearly based off the idea of God and Lucifer, and in that story, God was the stronger of the two of them, we're just gonna say that the Demon King is the weaker of the two. And there actually is a little bit of evidence to back this up, but like not enough for me to have like a hard stance. So if you think the Demon King is stronger than the Supreme Deity, okay. Fine. We're going to talk about the Demon King now. The Demon King is very obviously the ruler of the Demon Clan. He's a lot more than that. See, the Demon King has existed for almost as long as the universe. And since a lot of the main characters in Seven Deadly Sins are demons, a lot of the story revolves around the Demon King. This is mostly because the Demon King is the father of both Meliodas and Zeldris. And on top of this, he's the person who handpicked and gave power to all of the 10 Commandments. But he's done a whole lot more than even just all that. See, the Demon King is not only the creator of the demon realm and all demons, but he's also a guy in perpetual fear of losing the power that he spent thousands of years building up. Well, how do we know this? Well, because basically everything the Demon King does is to assure that he holds on to the power that he's spent his entire life building up. See, when Chaos decided to create the humans and the human realm, the Demon King felt immediately threatened, as the humans in the human realm were the closest to the demons in the demon realm out of all other races. And because the demon realm had gotten so big, the Demon King realized he needed help ruling. And so the Demon King's original plan to find somebody to help him rule was to split his power in half and create kind of a second Demon King. However, he immediately realized that this might be an issue because he'd be creating an entity as powerful as him who's also a ruler. So what he did instead is took half of his power and then split that 50% into 10 commandments. And he handed these 10 commandments down to demons he thought were worthy of receiving 5% of his power. But a thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the Demon King didn't end there, as the Demon King also created an entity known as the original demon. We gave a massive amount of his power to and made him his retainer. However, possibly drunk on the power that the Demon King gave him, the original demon staged a rebellion against the Demon King, which the Demon King squashed and then decided to punish the original demon by splitting him into two separate demons, Chandler and Cusack, who he would force into being tutors for his two sons, Zeldris and Meliodas. Now, the demons in the Demon Clan and the Demon King battled against the angels and the Angel Clan and the Supreme Deity for thousands of years, until eventually they decided that they were too evenly matched and they decided to make a truce. That truce was broken 3,000 years ago, and that's basically the plot of Seven Deadly Sins. But it did take the Goddess Clan, the humans, the Fairy Clan, and the Giant Clan to defeat the Demon Clan. But in a battle where two sides are perfectly evenly matched, if you add anything to the other side, that's gonna sway the battle in their favor. Not to mention the Vampire Clan, who are being ruled over by the Demon Clan, used this holy war as an opportunity to rebel against the Demon King, who they've always hated. So a lot of things went against the Demon King all at once, which is why the Demon Clan loses the holy war. Now, does this make the Demon King weaker than the Supreme Deity? I mean, maybe. I mean, he certainly had less allies than the Supreme Deity, and I would argue being likable enough to find allies to help you in battle is a strength of sorts. There's a lot more we could talk about as it pertains to the Demon King, but we'll save that for his own video. Let's talk about how hard he punching. Meliodas, the main character of Seven Deadly Sins, has openly admitted to the fact that no amount of training would ever make him as powerful as the Demon King. Even with Meliodas tapping into the power that Zeldris was able to borrow from the Demon King, he admitted that he would never be able to reach the Demon King's original level of power. And therefore, Meliodas understood that the only way that he would ever stand a chance in a battle against the Demon King is if he absorbed all 10 commandments, as only upon absorbing all 10 commandments would Meliodas achieve 50% of the Demon King's power. And considering the fact that the Demon King only has 50% of the Demon King's original power, Meliodas would stand a chance. I mean, Bon and Wild battled against the Demon King for 60 years, and the Demon King never got a scratch. He was able to single-handedly snuff out the rebellion of the Vampire Clan, and Meliodas himself admitted that during the Holy War, he was effortlessly killed by his father. So what are the Demon King's abilities? Well, one, he's immortal, and I mean like immortal. Your average demon can live about 1,000 years. The Demon King has been in purgatory for 1 billion. Yes, that's 1 billion with a B. And the fact that the Demon King was able to survive in purgatory, which is the worst place in any of the realms in the Seven Deadly Sins universe, for even 1 year, let alone 1 billion of those years, speaks to his resilience. His most broken ability is his ability, the Ruler. Now, this is an ability that only belongs to the Demon King, and that's why it's named after the Demon King. This ability allows the Demon King to invert all attacks sent at him. Now, not in the capacity of Meliodas's full counter where you send the attack back at your opponent. No, inverted in the sense that, let's say, hypothetically, you attack the Demon King with intent to harm. That attack will be inverted so that it actually heals the Demon King. Let's say hypothetically you shoot a poison dart at the Demon King. That poison dart, instead of poisoning and weakening the Demon King, will actually fortify him and make him stronger. But it goes even beyond that, because when Bon tried to steal one of the Demon King's hearts and therefore steal his energy, Bon was actually forced to give his energy over to the Demon King. Now, technically, there is a way to beat this. Let's say if hypothetically you tried to heal the Demon King, it will hurt him. You can simply just turn off his inversion abilities, so any Uno reverse carding you're trying to do on him will be nothing nullified. Outside of this, the Demon King has pretty much full control over the concept of darkness. See, when the Demon King is in Meliodas' body, he's able to either make a disembodied head or a full body out of darkness that he's able to shoot like a projectile at an opponent. Now, this full body of darkness that he was able to create while in Meliodas' body is able to attack so swiftly that it was able to outclass Zeldris' swordsmanship. And considering the fact that Zeldris is probably top 5 strongest people in the Seven Deadly Sins universe that aren't gods, and a lot of that power revolves around using a sword, that's saying something. This isn't the only time that the Demon King decided to, I almost said slip into one of his sons, but that felt wrong. Inhabit one of his sons. And when the Demon King is in Zeldris' body, he's able to create a massive sword out of darkness and a beast of darkness, which is a massive monster with a ton of arms created from darkness. But let's say hypothetically the Demon King doesn't want to beat around the bush with you. He doesn't want to make some entity out of darkness that he can use to kill you, because that's a lot of steps. He has another ability known as Death Zero, where the Demon King just surrounds you with his darkness and then crushes you with the immense pressure of it. No disembodied head, no many-armed monster, no sword, just darkness and death. Now, the second most important ability that the Demon King has is Commandment. Now, while at its base level, this might just seem like the Demon King breaking up 50% of his power into 10 little segments. In actuality, it's a lot more than that. See, because while yes, technically the Demon King did just give 5% of his power to 10 different demons, he also gave a curse to 10 separate demons. And these 10 curses not only held the demons who received the commandments to the rules of this curse, but also held anybody that the 10 commandments would get into a fight with to the rules of the curse. And what's crazy is that these curses actually aren't fueled by magical power. See, if any of the 10 commandments are drained of their power, the commandment that was bestowed upon them by the Demon King still holds up. And what's even wilder than that is if one of these commandments is given to somebody outside of the demon clan, the commandment will make them into a demon. And the only way to get rid of your commandment is to either give consent to having your commandment removed, to be too powerless to fight back against having your commandment removed, or to die. So it's a curse that gives you 5% of the Demon King's power and a set of rules to live by for the rest of your life. Gotta take the good with the bad. But these aren't the only curses that the Demon King dabbles in, as the most prominent curse that the Demon King uses throughout the entirety of Seven Deadly Sins isn't even actually the 10 Commandments, but instead the perpetual reincarnation curse that he places on both Elizabeth and Meliodas. It causes the victims to perpetually die and reincarnate while forgetting their previous lives. However, if the person in the perpetual reincarnation cycle gets enough information about their previous lives, they will begin to reawaken to the power they had in said previous lives. However, once their memories and their power is fully restored, they'll die in 3 days. Now that is a curse. Now, outside of this, the Demon King also has complete and total control over all nature, as when the Demon King wanted to destroy Belialuin, the place where he believed Merlin was currently living, he created a fog of death as well as fire and lightning to destroy the entire city in hopes of killing Merlin. And on top of all this, the Demon King is entirely telepathic, having the ability to communicate telepathically with his representative even while existing in Purgatory, an entirely separate dimension. He also has the ability to use the eyesight of any creature on Earth, which is how he would keep an eye on Meliodas and Zeldris when they were still running errands for the Demon Clan. So yeah, he's incredibly powerful. He's a god, that kind of makes sense. But is he more powerful than the Supreme Deity? Probably not, but also maybe, because coming in at number 2, we have the Supreme Deity. Like I said, there's some evidence for the Supreme Deity being the stronger of these two entities, even though Seven Deadly Sins focuses pretty hard on the fact that they're equally matched, as the Supreme Deity was the one who won the Holy War, and there's some kind of compelling evidence to show that the Supreme Deity was the smarter of the two, as when Merlin drew the attention of both the Supreme Deity and the Demon King, as she was a human born with infinite magical power, Merlin told both the Demon King and the Supreme Deity, whichever two of you gives me the better blessing, I'll side with. And the Supreme Deity gave Merlin the ability to be immune to dark curses, while the Demon King gave Merlin immunity to the Angel Clan's brainwashing ability, on top of all of the magical knowledge and power from the Demon Clan. Now, technically, one could make the argument that the Demon King was just trying to give the better blessing here over the Supreme Deity in order to get Merlin on his side. And if, hypothetically, Merlin didn't lie about aligning with one of them and went to the side of the Demon King, this would have been a good move. However, when you consider the fact that Merlin did lie about aligning with one of them and just took both of their blessings and ran, it does kind of make the Demon King look a little bit worse than the Supreme Deity, because all the Supreme Deity gave Merlin was the ability to avoid the wrath of the Demon King, while the Demon King gave Merlin the ability to avoid the wrath of the Supreme Deity and all of our information and magical power. So maybe the Supreme Deity is a bit smarter. Whatever, who cares? They're pretty much equal in strength, but somebody had to be at number 2. And maybe the reason that we put the Supreme Deity at number 2 is because she created more than one clan. See, the Supreme Deity is the creator of the Goddess Clan, and the Goddess Clan on Earth eventually became the Celestial Clan, which means both the Goddess Clan and the Celestial Clan tie their roots back to the Supreme Deity. Outside of this, the Supreme Deity is also the entity that granted graces to the 4 archangels, as well as being the mother to Elizabeth. I'm just now realizing that 7 Deadly Sins is just Groundhog's Day meets Romeo and Juliet. Now, the backstory of the Supreme Deity is pretty much identical to the backstory of the Demon King, because they were made strictly to oppose each other. However, instead of taking 50% of her power and splitting it into 10 separate entities, the Supreme Deity simply created 4 graces from her power and bestowed them upon the strongest goddesses in her clan, thus creating the 4 archangels. Now, these 4 archangels, very similarly to the 10 Commandments, come in varying levels of power. See, Sariel and Tariel are very powerful entities, but not nearly as powerful as the 2 other archangels, Ludaciel, the leader of the archangels, and Mael. And while the weakest archangel is probably a lot stronger than the weakest of the 10 Commandments, there are a substantial amount less archangels than 10 Commandments. So much in a similar capacity to how the Demon King and the Supreme Deity are supposed to be equal, so are by and large the 10 Commandments and the 4 archangels. However, on top of the 4 archangels, the Supreme Deity also had a daughter, Elizabeth, whose powers as a member of the Goddess Clan have put her on par with the rest of the archangels, meaning there's kind of 5 archangels. Now, while the Supreme Deity does have a lot of similarities with the Demon King, its abilities are definitely nothing like the Demon King's. Well, I guess they do both have power bestowment abilities, but most of their abilities are different. The first and most important ability that the Supreme Deity has is Arc. This is a technique that the Goddess Clan, and most importantly the Supreme Deity, has that allows them to make light particles. Now, this technique, much in the same way that the Demon King is able to use darkness to inflict damage on his enemies, allows for the Goddess Clan to weaponize light. And whether the Goddess Clan is creating light particles to fire off offensively, or creating massive barriers out of light, essentially the core of it all is that the Goddess Clan has the ability to control light both offensively and defensively. On top of this, instead of inverting attacks that come her way, the Supreme Deity is actually invulnerable to all physical attacks. So if you try to slash her, shoot her, wrestle her, it's not going to go your way. The Supreme Deity also has an ability called Breath of Bless, which is also known as Cheat Hope. See, this technique allows high-level goddesses and the Supreme Deity to gather light in their hands. Sorry, this lunatic came into my house and demanded we make a podcast. It is much later in the day. And after they gather this light into their hands, they can blow that light onto somebody whose magic they want to boost. However, this boost comes with a caveat, and that caveat is that anybody who has their magical powers boosted through this technique also immediately becomes a fanatical zealot who no longer cares about being injured. The next ability that the Supreme Deity has is something known as Shinrai, which is a technique that allows the Supreme Deity to call lightning from all corners of the sky. Now, this lightning is so powerful that one of the strongest defensive abilities in all of 7 Deadly Sins, Chastiful's Pollen Garden, when working in combination with Gideon's lightning rod, was unable to stop it. She also has an ability that works similar to the Spirit Tree's Sunflower technique. That ability is the divine power of the 10 wings. See, much in the same vein that the Spirit Tree is able to absorb solar energy in the form of its sunflower attack, the Supreme Deity is able to absorb power that's like her power. So let's say hypothetically the Supreme Deity came under attack by one of her own goddesses. Because the techniques and abilities that that goddess would be using against her would be similar to her own powers, she would be able to absorb said powers. Now, the Supreme Deity, like the Demon King, also has a power bestowment ability. However, instead of having to split her power into other vessels like the Demon King has to, the Supreme Deity is simply able to grant powers to people she believes are trustworthy. And these powers grant the goddesses that she grants these powers to additional power that's related to nature, which is why Ludaciel has Flash, and Sariel has Tornado, Carmiel has Ocean, and Mael has Sunshine. All 4 techniques relate to something in nature. However, unlike the Demon King, the Supreme Deity isn't able to give these graces to humans, as if these graces fell into the hands of humans, it would slowly but surely rip their bodies apart. The only exception to this rule is Escanor, and we're never really told why. We're just told that the only person who was deemed worthy of Sunshine after Mael turned into Estarossa and lost his grace was Escanor, so he got to be the one human in all of history who got a grace. But power bestowment isn't the only thing that the Supreme Deity has in common with the Demon King, because the Supreme Deity is also pretty good at curses, with the Supreme Deity's most important curse being immortality, just like the Demon King. And this immortality curse leads to an infinite amount of revivals, regardless of how many times you die. The only known person to ever be afflicted by this curse is Meliodas, as both the Demon King and the Supreme Deity had a hand in cursing him. And the Supreme Deity can fly and see through Elizabeth's eyes, and so on and so forth. She has a couple of other minor abilities, but they're really not worth talking about. All in all, she's supposed to be the perfect counter for the Demon King, and therefore kind of just his light side. And that's kind of all she is. The Demon King controls darkness, she controls light. He can give commandments, she can give graces. They are two sides of the same coin, and that's why saying one is stronger than the other, it can really go either way. But fortunately, that's only the case for them. See, because the Spirit Tree, the Supreme Deity, and the Demon King were all made by the same entity. And that entity is Mama Hawk. No, I'm literally not kidding. See, the more accurate description of what made the Spirit Tree and the Demon King and the Supreme Deity would be Chaos, an ancient, omnipotent entity that created everything. God. Merlin describes Chaos as an entity of pure darkness that the demons fear, and an entity of pure light that the angels worship. In its non-sealed form, it's just kind of everything. An entity of pure light and creation. And because it's simply an entity of creation, it doesn't have much in the way of personality. That is, unless of course it takes the form of a proxy. See, because here's the thing. Chaos did create everything, including the Supreme Deity and the Demon King. However, when Chaos decided to create the human race, which was its favorite creation, the Supreme Deity and the Demon King got jealous of the human race and assumed that Chaos would favor the human race over their races and them themselves, and therefore the Supreme Deity and the Demon King worked together to seal Chaos. However, since Chaos isn't a physical entity, you can't really seal it. And therefore, instead of being sealed, Chaos kind of just became something else. And that something else was Chaos existing inside of a moss shell that would be known as the Mother of Chaos. That would later become, I shit you not, Hawk Mama, which means the giant pig that the boar's hat sits on top of for the entirety of 7 Deadly Sins is the god of the universe, which is why Hawk Mama is able to do things like swallow incredibly powerful magic, and why Hawk Mama is never really in danger from anybody. Now, Chaos currently has a different host than Hawk Mama and has had a couple of different hosts over the duration of the 7 Deadly Sins universe, as the Lady of the Lake and Cath Plug are two sides of the same coin as it pertains to Chaos, with the Lady of the Lake having Chaos's infinite wisdom and Cath Plug having its destructive ability. But the current vessel for Chaos is actually Arthur Pendragon, the King of Chaos, which is why Arthur Pendragon is the bad guy in the Four Knights of the Apocalypse. Now, I could very easily do an entire video on Chaos, so I'm gonna leave it there for the moment, because getting into what Chaos is and what that has to do with Arthur and Merlin really is a descriptor of what's going on in the Four Knights of the Apocalypse manga. Well, at least it's a descriptor of how we got to where we currently are in the Four Knights of the Apocalypse manga. It's also wrought with spoilers for the end of the 7 Deadly Sins manga, and it's kind of complicated. So, how hard does Chaos punchy? Well, it's so hard that punchies don't really matter. See, Chaos is by far and away the strongest entity in the entirety of the 7 Deadly Sins universe. Chaos has the ability to create anything out of nothing. It has immeasurable power and no physical form. In fact, ancient legends say that Chaos created the world, the Supreme Deity, and the Demon King all on a whim. And Chaos's creations were so powerful that they themselves were considered gods, and these gods were so powerful they could create their own dimensions for their own clans to live. And these two gods, when working with each other, weren't even able to destroy Chaos, but instead only able to kind of bottle it in a shell made out of moss by giving that moss shell sentience. But regardless of how powerful Chaos is, in order for Chaos to use its abilities, it has to have a proxy. Now, whether that proxy is Hawk Mama or Arthur Pendragon, it doesn't really matter. However, it wasn't until the end of the 7 Deadly Sins manga that Chaos was truly able to incarnate in Arthur Pendragon, because up until the end of the manga, Arthur was only able to use the power of Chaos unconsciously, which made it so everything around Arthur Pendragon unconsciously bend to his will. And what's truly wild about all of this is that Cath Plug, after consuming Arthur's right arm, was able to manifest part of Chaos's abilities. And with just part of Chaos's abilities, Cath Plug had the ability to transcend life and death. He could bend space and time to his liking, and he could trap people in alternative future timelines. However, as time progressed, Arthur has become more and more acquainted with Chaos, so much so that he's now been able to make his own dimension, like the Demon King or the Supreme Deity for Camelot, with a barrier around it that stops any race that aren't humans from entering. So yeah, how powerful is Chaos? as powerful as it gets in the Seven Deadly Sins universe. How powerful is an entity that has infinite power, can create anything from nothing, and has no physical form? Where I'm from, you just call that God. What do you guys think about all this? Do you want more information about the gods of the Seven Deadly Sins universe? Do you want me to do a ranking explaining of the archangels, or do you want me to do a deep dive on chaos? Tell me in the comments below. And to why you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit that noti bell. The fact that Seven Deadly Sins does as well on this page as it does is absolutely wild to me.